Now to a big policy pivot from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis that reflects a giant change in Republican priorities. DeSantis now says backing Ukraine is not a vital U.S. interest. Look at this. While the United States has many vital national interests, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. His answer, part of a questionnaire the Fox host Tucker Carlson sent to Republican presidential hopefuls. Our great reporters are back at the table. Ron DeSantis now says it is not a vital U.S. interest, and he calls it a territorial dispute. Ron DeSantis, as a member of the House in the Obama administration, we in the Congress have been urging the president I've been to provide arms to Ukraine. They want to fight their good fight. They're not asking us to fight it for them, and the president has steadfastly refused, and I think that's a mistake. So a flip-flop. Why?
The Tucker tail is wagging the dog. That's why. I mean, look at the forum through which he wanted to give this information, from a host on Fox News who has been railing against the U.S. involvement in Ukraine, has been supporting autocrats who are in and around the region. And this is a person who has a large audience within the Republican electorate. And so that's why you see a flip-flop there. What's interesting is, as you were talking about that, Nikki Haley, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, came out with her answers to that. I mean, by the way, can we just talk about the fact that it is Tucker Carlson who is sending questionnaires to these candidates? That says everything. But she stuck to the more traditional Republican line, which is, yes, it is important to the U.S. national interest to stay and help the Ukrainians.
Right. And so let's go through some of the different answers which tell you we are no longer living in Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. No. There are still people like Nikki Haley who voice that view, but it's increasingly, I would say, a minority. Or, Donald Trump. No. The question is opposing Russia and Ukraine a vital American national strategic interest? Donald Trump says no, but it is for Europe, but not for the United States. Mike Pence disagrees. When the United States supports Ukraine in their fight against Putin, we follow the Reagan doctrine. DeSantis, again, he's with Trump, more or less. Becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Nikki Haley, as you know, says, yes, the Russian government is a powerful dictatorship that makes no secret of its hatred of America, and fellow South Carolinian Tim Scott, degrading the Russian military is in our vital national interest. Even the way the question is framed, in the idea that this isn't, Ron DeSantis wants to make it about Russia and Ukraine, Putin and Zelensky, as opposed to an attack on a huge democracy in Europe, access to Ukrainian, the breadbasket, if you will, of Europe, all the economic and agricultural power that would give him. And then what about Moldova? What about the NATO countries, the Eastern European countries that join NATO?
Well, I think the answer from a lot of the Republican presidential candidates, Republican primary voters would be, so what about Moldova, right? That this is a party that just doesn't really care about that stuff in the same way, or at least that's what it looks like on the surface right now. And I think one of the big questions about this race, right, for years now, the loudest voices in the Republican Party have been saying what we hear from Donald Trump, right? That's not our problem, that's Europe's problem. It's a territorial dispute that doesn't concern us. You know, I am old enough to remember when this was a really solidly hawkish party, and when an underdog presidential candidate in John McCain back in 2008 sort of rose from the dead as a candidate on the strength of his sort of hawkish policy credentials. And I do wonder how much there is some of that vestigial DNA still in the party, that if you ask the question as do you want to sort of go to the wall for Ukraine, a lot of people might shy away from that. But do you support a strong and assertive America? Do you support a world that is led by the United States and not sort of shared by a couple different superpowers? I do think those instincts are still there. And the question is there someone in the race who can play to that?
If he's old enough to remember, it means it wasn't that long ago.
Right. No, well, the issue, and DeSantis tries to make this point, Republicans are trying to say stand up to China and sort of never mind Europe, never mind Putin, never mind Russia. The question is, can you sell that argument, or will somebody like McCain stand up and say it's a lot more complicated than that, and everything you do against Russia and Ukraine has an impact on the China conversation? But for that person to break through, for a Haley to break through, or a Pence to break through, or somebody else, they're walking into the heavy breeze right now. This is from our brand new poll. Is it important that the Republican nominee believes the U.S. should not be involved in Russia-Ukraine? 36%, more than a third of Republicans say it's essential. 44% say it's important to them. So add that up. 80% of Republican voters, or potential Republican voters, don't think it's that, it's not important to them, essentially, that the Republicans agree with President Biden on this one.
And you do see dampening support among Republicans on this issue, but that is not the same as what you're seeing in Congress. Within Congress, this is still what you're describing is a minority viewpoint. I've talked to almost a dozen lawmakers recently about this on both sides of the aisle, and they still feel strongly about support for Ukraine. Now, there is that Ukraine fatigue group that Matt Gaetz is leading. There's roughly a dozen lawmakers in the House that does not want to provide further support to Ukraine. But again, there's only 11 people who've signed on to that resolution. As for this questionnaire, Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas, was one of those who did not answer it. But in an interview over the weekend with USA Today, he linked China and Ukraine together and said he sees this as important to deterring China from invading Taiwan.
One of my favorite subplots is the Florida Republican debate. You have Trump and Desantis essentially on the same page when it comes to Ukraine. Marco Rubio, who's not running this time, said on Hewitt today there is a national security issue in Ukraine. And he said DeSantis, quote, doesn't deal with foreign policy every day as governor. So little poke there. We're just getting started in the Republican race.